This conversation in Tushita Talks to the World, I'd really like to welcome Professor Robin Jeffrey from Melbourne. Professor Jeffrey is a visiting professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore and an emeritus professor from both La Trobe University, Melbourne and the Australian National University in Canberra. He's a very well-known scholar and has authored a number of books, edited a number of books and co-authored a number of books, including most recently with Assa Doron, a book titled Waste of a Nation, Garbage and Growth in India, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. In particular, Professor Jeffrey is a specialist in South Asia, most particularly India, including in the area of communications, phones, newspapers, etc., public sanitation, and also Kerala, a state in southern India. Thank you, Professor Jeffrey, for appearing on Tushita Talks to the World.
Hello, Christopher. Very nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well, and thank you for being the first interviewee on Tushita Talks. It's great to have you here. Now, look, I know you've been involved with India for quite a while, and I know you started off in Punjab, and today, of course, is a very significant day because on this day in 1947, the Radcliffe Awards were announced, which divided Punjab between India and Pakistan. And a lot has happened since then, including at the moment in Punjab, a government led by a gentleman called Amarinder Singh, who's the grandson of the Maharaja of Patiala. Do you think that's interesting, significant?
Amarinder Singh, of course, has been in Indian public life for 60 years. Yeah. He would have been the Maharaja Patiala had Mrs. Gandhi not abolished the privy purses and the Maharajas in 1971. So the family, because Patiala was a major state, the princely family would have protected a lot of its wealth even after 1971. And as well, of course, as a young man brought up in a princely family, he has had and still has all the right connections and a certain amount of awe and majesty, I guess you could say, amongst ordinary people. He's someone who should have been a Maharaja if you're a royalist. So I think that those are all advantages that he's brought. He's chosen to stay with the Congress in troubled times, and Punjab has a kind of political environment that's pretty unique to Punjab. Almost, you could say, a two-party system with the old Akali Dal being in power and the Congress out, and then the Congress being in and the Akali Dal being out. So he's perhaps seen that there was more in terms of keeping his own position in society, being with the Congress than not being. And he's been able to retain that even in these very BJP times that we live in now.
Which sort of then leads into the phenomenon of the BJP. They've become extraordinarily popular with Indians, and as we saw in the 2019 election, they were returned with an increased majority. Now, I know it's a coalition government, but they're the main party, the backbone of that coalition. Has that surprised you to see them rise, Robin?
Not really, given the thing with the BJP is that it has had a dedicated cadre ever since independence, and it's kind of, what would you say, its street-level presence in the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, the RSS, the street-level presence has similarly been there before 1947. And these are true believers. These are people who want, to my eyes, what they want is a Hindu Pakistan. They want a religious dominant state. The temple that's been built in Ayodhya or the temple that will be built now in Ayodhya, is a kind of mark of that. It's to build a sort of St. Peter's Basilica on Mecca, to give the faithful a target to aim for when they go on holiday or on pilgrimage, a great site. And that's, I think, being part of the BJP recipe is to try to create this notion of let's make India, it's the let's make India great again notion. India was great 1,000 years ago. We can make it great again if we begin to respect our cultural traditions. And that's a powerful kind of glue to hold together small groups of true believers. And in today's world, of course, once you begin to command the media, you get the opportunity to run the state, and you're able to turn the power of modern telecommunications to your advantage, as the BJP have done. You're able to build a huge, and in the case of 2019 elections, a dependable party presence. The BJP is, I think we were talking earlier, claims party membership now of 180 million members. Now that's nearly twice the size of the Communist Party of China. And I'm told that when BJP senior officials are pressed on this, they couldn't possibly have 180 members, 180 million members. It's ridiculous. They will say, no, we've got phone numbers for all of them. And that's believable because Indian phone density now is more than 100% in raw absolute subscriber terms.
Well, that's been a major change in my lifetime. The first time I went to India, there were no computers. Now, the spread of that sort of information communication technology throughout the nation is extraordinary. Now, we're also seeing some negatives about that. For example, Rahul Gandhi today has said that Facebook is favouring the BJP, and we've also seen recently allegations of corruption and various other things. And Reliance now is obviously very powerful and almost squeezing its competition out of the market. Do you see any sort of ramifications of those sorts of technologies on the Indian electoral system?
Well, I think, in fact, we have seen it in the 2019 election, where the BJP's Telecom war room was just immensely effective. And the BJP had polling booth level captains with little teams. These are party members mobilizing the vote in probably 90% of those polling booths. It's a huge organizational achievement, but it's made possible by the ability to make these people feel that they're part of a great party structure, because people higher up in the chain are ringing them up, sending them messages, sending them memes and so on, which can then be used for electoral purposes for the 1,000 or so electors at that who live around that polling booth. So it's really like being made class captain of your high school with about 1,000 members, and your job is to get all of the boys and girls to the games, or in this case, the polling booth on the day, with the right message, and the message is about who to vote for. And Telecom has made that possible, and Telecom at the moment is dominated by the BJP, not necessarily as a result of incorrect or corrupt processes, simply because they've had the technology, they've had the technological muscle power to do it, and also the ground game to enroll people, ensure that they're providing the central headquarters with the right kind of details, and making them feel that they're part of a living organism, which is this political party. There's much to admire in this in some ways, but it's the ends that one has to be more skeptical about.
Well, it sounds like they're very well organised, and they're certainly a truly national force. But in terms of their agenda, this so-called Hindutva agenda, which talks about Hindi, Hindu, and Hindustan. Now, Hindustan I can understand, the land of the Hindus. Hindi is problematic. Hindu is also challenging. Hindi itself, though, now in the south of India, the Tamils would be very reluctant to have Hindi imposed on them. So is it a unifying ideology? First of all, can I ask you what the ideology is, if you can describe that briefly? And then secondly, is it a unifying or a divisive ideology, do you think?
As far as the ideology goes, I don't think it's ever been. Certainly, people have attempted in the past. The the people who coined the term more than 100 years ago were talking about a Hindu-dominated state in which the Hindu population had regained its muscularity, its ability to defend itself against threats. And those were usually Muslim, thought to be Muslim threats. After all, Muslim rulers had been running the place when the British arrived, on the whole. So it's fair, I think, a fairly simple set of ideas about all positions should be really controlled by our idea, and our idea has been a kind of cast Hindu, rather Victorian notion of what it is to be a good Hindu. It, as far as the language question goes, Hindi, I think, probably made greater strides throughout India in the times when no one was actually advocating it in any aggressive kind of way, and when it was when Hindi cinema and Hindi commercials on television and Hindi television generally was doing the work of popularizing the language. There's nothing like good entertainment to make people want to learn a language. I think the aggressive push on Hindi, which is, you can see now amongst some of the segments, I think, of the BJP and its supporters, that aggressive push is getting backs up in Tamil Nadu. We're certainly seeing people saying, well, we're not going to have them stuff Hindi down our throats. But even in Bengal, that Bengalis don't particularly want the idea of Hindi being pushed at them in quite the same way. And the notion, too, that in the rest of India, people who don't speak Hindi are somehow less welcome, even Bengalis, I would say, and certainly people from the Northeast have always felt a little bit, more than a little bit alienated in continental North India, Hindi-speaking in North India. So I think the Hindi, if I were advising the BJP, I would be saying, well, look, go a little bit easy on this Hindi thing, because it's not going to do you an awful lot of long-term good. You'd be far better to encourage some more great Hindi soaps and some more great Hindi epic cinema if you're really trying to propagate Hindi in a palatable way to the non-Hindi speaking parts of the country, which are, after all, 60% of the country is non-Hindi speaking.
Yeah, but then the largest film industry in India is not Bollywood, but so-called Tollywood, the Telugu speaking film industry. So is there a reverse cultural aspect there that the Telugus or the Tamils can influence people through their film industries? Or
of course. And I mean, the Tamil industry was terribly important from the 1930s in creating the political parties that have ruled Tamil Nadu since 1967. Both of those parties had their origin in actors, scriptwriters, directors, producers of Tamil cinema, going back to the late 30s, certainly 1940s and 50s. Telugu cinema has become, it produced a chief minister in the 1980s, a leading film actor. So cinema is terribly powerful, but neither Tamil nor Telugu is going to take over the North or indeed make huge impacts outside of Tamil and Telugu speaking areas. Having said that, Telugu, I think, has probably 75 million speakers, so it's not a bad little audience if you're thinking you might watch your movies.
Well, there's about 80 million Tamils, I think, too, aren't there? So yes, you're talking about a large group of people. So if you're then not a member of this Hindu aspect of the Hindutva ideology, how are you feeling if you're a member of a minority in India?
Uneasy, I think, would be, I think it would be fair to say that Christians and Muslims particularly, Christians are 2 to 3% of the population, so some 20, 30 million people, uneasy at the very least, and positively fearful at the very worst. And there are no shortage of stories over the last 5 years of lynchings of people associated who accused of cow slaughter. The other group in India, which elements of which will feel or do feel marginalized, are Dalits, people who were once called untouchables. Certainly the BJP is making a great effort to capture Dalits. It wins Dalit seats, reserved seats in parliament. There are some 80 or 100 seats in the national parliament reserved for only Dalit candidates. The BJP has done very well with those. So the BJP would profess, I think, to represent Dalits or seek to represent Dalits and include them in the fold of Hinduism. In practice, at the grassroots level, that's a much more spotty kind of performance. But there are certainly, look, to me, India has always been, and I think still is really, it's a great biryani. It's a wonderfully marinated rice dish with a wonderful mixture of herbs and spices and some cashew nuts and some chopped up apricot and sultanas, this wonderful kind of richness. And that's what's been its great strength. And the BJP would like to create a smoothie out of all this, put it in the blender and it will all come out looking the same. Well, it may not be a very palatable consumption item at the end of that process. But I prefer the biryani, and I don't think there's anything particularly bad about the biryani.
But there's a lot of Indians who like the BJP, and while they've still got first past the post voting, which I think probably favours the BJP, but how do you sort of explain that incredible popularity at the moment?
Well, because it is something that people can relate to easily. The BJP, I think, won about 37% of the votes cast in the elections in 2019. So about 60% of the population didn't vote for the BJP. But that wasn't out of any great conviction for another option. The BJP also have offered at least a program. And they've executed the program. They will, it's very much part of their story at the moment, is that we said we would do things. We said we would tidy up Kashmir. We said we would build a temple. We're doing these things. And they have a popular prime minister in Narendra Modi. And Modi has prepared for this since he was an adolescent. And again, there'd be much to admire if it weren't that the ends look so troubled, I think would be the best word. Where this goes is to some troubling places. There's an element, of course, of the Trump, the Duterte, the Turkish, the Hungarian experiences here. These are all popular leaders with very easy to understand, simple national messages. The BJP, I think, at the moment, does more to actually implement some of the promises, and of course has made a great thing of emphasizing that it was going to be development for everyone. And to a certain extent, there have been genuine attempts to achieve this, I think.
So on another issue, the Supreme Court has found on Friday the 14th against advocate Prashant Bhushan. Three judges have found him guilty of criminal contempt of court for 2 tweets from some time ago, which the court said were based on distorted facts, and they constituted, and I quote, a scurrilous, malicious attack on the entire Supreme Court and had the effect of destabilising the very foundation of the judiciary. Now, he hasn't yet been sentenced, Mr. Bhushan, but how do you feel about that particular judgment?
I think the Daily from Chennai, the Hindu, had an editorial on this morning, which said it reflected poorly on the Supreme Court if such things got under its collective skin. But it wouldn't be the first time that Supreme Courts in India have had incidents where the outcome reflected poorly on them. So it's not surprising, but it sounded from what I've seen of the tweets that they were fairly inconsequential. But the court is clearly a bit touchy these days.
Well, generally speaking, India has been a very wonderful democracy, allowing freedom of speech and dissent and various other things. And there has been some blips, and they're not just BJP. We think of the emergency under Indira Gandhi. How do you think, generally speaking, though, people are feeling about their ability to speak freely in India at the moment?
I think people are very, very guarded. The mainstream media is pretty careful in what it says, and people who tweet are conscious that anything they tweet that may offend the supporters of the current government will bring down upon them a great raft of trolling from BJP supporters. Somebody like Tavleen Singh, who's a tough old journalist who's been around for 40, 50 years, she's been a supporter of the BJP in the past, partly because she was so keen to see the end of the Congress domination. But she takes a lot of stick whenever the Indian Express publish her column. And when she's critical, she often comes back the following week and says, I've been getting a lot of these nitwits on my Twitter feed over the last 7 days. So it's a time when people, if they want a quiet life, are terribly guarded about what they're saying.
Well, the other interesting thing is that in the course of the next few months, years, that the BJP will gain absolute control of the upper house as well. Are we likely to see any major changes thereafter as a result of that control, or have they already got so many people on side? And I'm thinking in particular of the Jammu and Kashmir reorganisation bills that went through very smoothly with a lot of popular support. So you could almost argue that they've got control of the upper house as well.
The important thing is to have, I think we need a 2/3 majority in the Rajya Sabha in order to amend the constitution. And then you need the support of 2/3 of states, a formula like that. And I think the BJP would like to complete their project by amending the constitution and probably introducing stronger constitutional provisions for protecting the cow, removing the word secular from the preamble, which was inserted by Indira Gandhi back in the bad old days of the emergency. So that one can't say that there was something particularly sacred about that particular word and its insertion at the moment it was inserted. But I think those sorts of things, the cow protection, removing secular, there'd be a couple of other items probably. So the tidying up in BJP terms of the Constitution, I think would be one of the items that they would be on the agenda once they control the Rajya Sabha, which I think there's every likelihood they'll do in the next 18 months. The Rajya Sabha is elected in a kind of slightly complicated way, giving votes to members of state legislatures. So you need to control state legislatures too in order to get people into the Rajya Sabha.
The 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act, do you think that's going to have any major impact on India and its ongoing population?
It has already, I think, in mobilizing sections of the population to oppose it. How it's implemented, of course, will depend on the will of the government of the day. And the current government, in its triumphalist mood and with an aggressive home minister, may decide that they want to try to implement this act across the country in a very kind of comprehensive way, and I think that will lead to reaction, certainly.
What about India's neighbours? Do you think it? I'm thinking in particular Bangladesh because of this issue with the Bengali Muslims who are supposedly illegal, and there's some millions of them up there in the northeast.
Bangladesh, I don't think would be willing to, quote, take back tens of thousands of its purported citizens. I think that's highly unlikely. India, at the moment, is, I think, probably on better terms with Bangladesh than most of its other neighbors. It will be interesting to see how the new Rajapaksa government relates to the Modi government in Delhi. I haven't seen, I would expect them to get on quite well, but it would depend a little bit, though, on how the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka develop their relationship with China. Obviously, the Indians want to keep the Chinese out of Trincomalee and Hambantota and so on in Sri Lanka.
I think they're running a bit late on Hambantota. I think the Chinese have already got that, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view. The Nepali one's interesting too, because India-Nepal relations generally were quite close, but they seem to be distancing from one another at the moment, or moving away.
I think Nepal is feeling a little bit like the meat in the sandwich. It is, after all, the buffer between China and India, and there will be pressures on that northern border of Nepal. And probably whispers in Kathmandu from Chinese diplomats that if Nepal wants big favors from China, Nepal needs to be, what should we say,
forthcoming.
To get up India's nose a little bit. You know, don't be afraid of prodding India, because we're right behind you, literally, in fact.
Yeah. So how do you feel then about India's future in, say, the next 5 to 10 years? You know, we've got, another election in 2024 when they'll be past their 75th anniversary. And so there's going to be a lot of glory coming out of the 75th commemoration.
The old Harold Wilson line. A week is a long time in politics. And I guess one could look back again at the Indira Gandhi years. Indira Gandhi in 1971 was the darling of most Indians. She'd won an election, defeated the Pakistanis, liberated Bangladesh, nationalized the banks, got rid of the privy purses. It was all looking pretty good. And within 4 years, she was desperate, absolutely desperate. And the emergency was the result of that. And within 6 years, she was out. Unfortunately, not permanently. It's no one would predict, but the BJP look very firmly established for the time being, it seems to me.
With sort of no chinks in their armour at all, it would seem.
Only there'll certainly be difficulties, perhaps of their own making, in running too hard on things that really aren't of all that great importance to improving the lot of large numbers of the population. But that would be the cultural agenda that is so powerful, and part, of course, of their appeal, the cultural agenda of making India great again, building temples, building statues. What the BJP has been good at is doing both, doing that, and also implementing some programs effectively. Gas bottles to the rural poor, these kinds of things. These are good things on the whole, but and they've been able to, it appears, to implement such programs fairly successfully.
It's interesting. I think they've done really well in terms of their national agenda and their nationalism and their, the reflection of the majoritarianism and those sorts of things. But on the other hand, economically, they don't seem to have done as well as Congress. At one stage there was 10% growth under a Congress government led by Dr. Manmohan Singh. The BJP's got close to 8%, I think, at one stage. And it's going to be interesting to see how they come back after the COVID thing, if it does disappear.
COVID, I think, does change everything. I don't think anybody can predict how any country is going to come back after COVID. And I see there's a story this morning from Amarinder, the freelancer who writes for The Guardian, on the penetration of COVID into rural India. And I mean, that's something we've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 months. Can you really confine this virus only to the cities? Once it gets into the countryside, won't it run rampant? Because the countryside is so much more vulnerable. There's so very little medical support available in much of the countryside, certainly of the sophisticated kind that's needed to ward off a severe case of this virus, it seems. So just how that affects the countryside and certainly the long-term recovery of the Indian economy, just as we're worried in Australia about the recovery of the Australian economy.
Yeah. So this youth bubble that India talks about, is this going to be a strategic advantage into the future, do you think, or it's going to be difficult if they can't create enough jobs for these young people?
You know, we haven't heard much about the demographic dividend for the last year or so, but I mean, I think the demographic dividend can also be a demographic part of the demographic downfall, in that if you have a large body of youth who can't be employed, who aren't sufficiently skilled to really to find work that's going to be profitable both for the employer and for them, then you really have impoverished people doing what they've done before. So they consume a little, but they don't consume enough to create an internal Indian industrial revolution in the way that a Henry Ford might have been said to, have driven American capitalism in the beginning of the 20th century by producing things cheaply so his workers could buy them. I don't think that's happening on a big scale in India today. And again, the Prime Minister in his Republic Day speech was talking about make in India for the world. So he'd like to find world markets for things made in India, but those markets are hard to build. And the Chinese have done it, the Koreans have done it, the Japanese probably did it first from the 1920s onward. But it's pretty hard to find products in the world today that are made in India where people say, I'd like the Indian one, please, not the Australian one or the Chinese one. Thank you very much.
So we began with Punjab, and I'd just like to finish with Punjab. And thank you very much for your involvement today, Robin. Really appreciate your thoughts. But how do the Sikhs feel about this whole Hindutva agenda? I know it's a religion that comes out of India, which makes them much more palatable.
I'm honestly not sure. In the fact that the Akali Dal and the BJP have often been in alliance in Punjab to form coalition governments in Punjab in opposition to the Congress, they can, in the past, I think they've been able to make peace by saying, well, we're both religious parties, we both believe in the sanctity of our holy books, we can pull on together against these, horrible secular, irreligious cosmopolitans that are in the Congress. That would be one way of trying to define that sort of coalition against a ruling Congress party. So it's certainly possible for that to, I think, to happen. That is, for the Akali Dal and Sikh institutions to pull on with the BJP, easier than probably for Christians or Muslims.
Robin, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. It's been terrific having you here, and I'm very honoured to have you as our first guest and our first interviewee. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christopher. Great fun.